I hope everybody can hear me. I want to congratulate all the honorees. I want to thank the leadership of the NAACP branch in Providence, President Vincent, the branch secretary, of course, Sister Nicole and Andrea and others. Of course, it's one of the oldest NAACP chapters in the country. And I want to thank you for your vision and your dedication. I want to also recognize all the people who are in attendance in person and those who attended the VIP social. I'm grateful for the leadership of Juan Cofield, the president of the New England Conference. And I want to thank all the people who made this event possible, those folks who are behind the scenes. Sister Rachel, thank you for making this virtual gathering a success. Now, we find ourselves as a country, and there's no reasonable way to deny this, in a moment of profound crisis. One might even say, with a degree of certainty, a high degree of certainty, that the nation is in profound trouble. America's changing, and the substance of that transformation is not clear. At least to me, it isn't. Who we will be as a nation has yet to come into view. But we see, if you are looking, dark forces mobilizing. We see those who, in the face of the demographic shifts, cleave to old ideas and illusions, and they insist that our way of life must not change. Many of us cut ourselves against the sharp edges of their passions. States across the country have enacted laws restricting access to voting, and we cannot seem to pass legislation to guarantee this fundamental pillar of democratic life. Folks have sought also to replace those persons who serve as safeguards of our democracy during the 2020 presidential race. They changed the rules in such a way that if they don't like the outcome of an election, it is now easier to overturn it all. On the one hand, denying folks the right to vote, and on the other, changing how they count the vote. Texas has restricted a woman's right to choose, and the Supreme Court right now prepares itself to overturn Roe v. Wade. We find ourselves in the grips of an intensifying culture war as fears of demographic shifts, you will not replace us, and historical revision, the fear that we will be displaced from the history books, stoke the flames of division. For the first time in American history, the white population in this country declined according to the US Census. And the debates about CRT, or critical race theory, and wokeism, quote unquote, have become the latest excuse for some to retreat into the comfort of their hatreds. It feels like panic and terror have gripped the nation. All of this is happening against the backdrop of a planet screaming. Historic hurricanes and floods, fires and earthquakes. All of this is happening as COVID rages, and over 780,000 of our fellow Americans are dead. All of this is happening in a political environment where one party seems to have been overrun by illiberal elements, and another seems too timid to fight for the America that is desperately trying to be born. Protecting our democracy, then, in this moment, is a tall order. I was talking the other day with the historian at Emory University, Carol Anderson. She's the author of White Rage and several books on voting and the Second Amendment. And we were discussing the historical parallels of this moment with the collapse of radical Reconstruction, the attack on Black voting, the violence that's underneath it, the complicity of the courts, the failure of government. But she used an analogy that struck me. She talked about boxers. When they were young, they're able to take the punches, the devastating punches, and bounce back. But as they get older, they can't rebound so quickly, she said. Their legs leave them, their chins soften. And she likened America to a punch-drunk boxer. And she worried out loud whether or not our democracy can survive another punch. January 6th was one of those punches. The sacking of the Capitol has to be understood, in my view, as part of the racial reckoning we face in this country today. That was a revolt predicated on white grievance and white resentment and white hatreds. And the question we must ask ourselves is, what are we to do about it all? How might we think of ourselves moving forward. Some among us wanted to turn the page quickly, to return to whatever was understood as a sense of normalcy. Some appealed to unity, reaching for a new ground for consensus amid the deep divisions that shaped the republic. But none of this matters, in my view, if we fail to confront the central contradiction at the heart of the matter. What some are calling the big lie that Democrats stole the election from Donald Trump. That lie rests on an even bigger lie that constitutes the through line of American history. That lie says that only white Americans matter, that only white voters matter, that white people ought to be valued more than others in this country. Now, some are willing to name Trump's lies or the lies of the other party, but they seem a bit reluctant to name the bigger lie that lurks beneath it all. Just this morning, I was on Morning Joe with Joe Scarborough, and Joe Scarborough admitted that race was at the heart of this current crisis we face. It seems to me, if we are sincere, and the question of sincerity is always a vexing issue in this country, if we are sincere, we have to face the insidious workings of this lie if we are to protect our democracy and imagine America anew. The time has come for us to examine ourselves for who we really are and in the full light of what we have done. And we must do so without the crutch of our myths and legends about American exceptionalism, legends that protect our innocence. That examination must involve an attempt, as James Baldwin said, to find out what is really happening here. Protecting our democracy in light of the real threats we face today involves, in my view, three things. One, taking responsibility for what we've done and what we are doing, holding ourselves accountable too for our actions. And three, imagining a new way, boldly imagining a new way of being together. So we have to be responsible. We have to hold ourselves accountable. And we have to boldly imagine and courageously act for a new America. All of which requires, in my view, that this nation grow up, that we leave behind the safety of national adolescence. Now, what do I mean by taking responsibility? Most Americans find comfort in myths and fables, illusions that confirm the inherent goodness of this grand experiment. Safety is found in the stories that tell us that America is an example of democracy achieved, that ours is the shining city on the hill. As James Baldwin wrote in The Fire Next Time, these stories would have us believe that, quote, our ancestors were all freedom loving heroes, that they were born in the greatest country the world has ever seen, or that Americans are invincible in battle and wise in peace, that Americans have always dealt honorably with Mexicans and Indians and all our other neighbors or inferiors, that American men are the world's most direct and virile. But there's a different story, a darker reality that haunts this place. It is one drenched in blood and tears. Unimaginable horror resides there, trauma passed on from generation to generation, and it is soaked in the soil of this country, especially in the region where I was born, in the South, where the landscape is often filled with monuments to that violence. Bridges where strange fruit dangle, places in the center of town that bear the markings of human sacrifice. What would it mean for this country to confront its history and its present, to be responsible for that history and its present, to admit that racial inequality in America is not the result of some random set of events, it is the consequence of deliberate policy, to admit of the violence that has shadowed this democracy from its inception, to not clutch our pearls in the face of what we are confronting right now in this moment, to understand that it is as American as apple pie, to confront the lie that rests at the heart of this fragile experiment in democracy, to tell the truth that race rests at the heart of our current malaise. We tell ourselves that we are an example of democracy achieved, that we are the shining city on the hill. But these stories aim to conceal the contradiction at the heart of this fragile experiment. James Baldwin put it this way in 1964, quote, "The people who settled the country had a fatal flaw. They could recognize a man when they saw one. They knew he wasn't anything else but a man. But since they were Christians and since they had already decided that they came here to establish a free country, the only way to justify the role this chattel was playing in one's life was to say that he was not a man. For if he wasn't, then no crime had been committed." Baldwin says, that lie is the basis of our present trouble. Hmm. We know this country has been and continues to be a place where the value gap affects the distribution of advantage and disadvantage. What is the value gap? This belief that some people, because of the color of their skin, ought to be valued more than others. This belief that some voters, because of the color of their skin, that their vote matter more than others. That some people deserve the full burden and benefit of citizenship, while others should shut up and be grateful. We know that we have created a way of life here in this country where some are valued and have standing, while others must experience what philosophers describe as a generalized sense of disregard. Our history repeatedly betrays us on this score. We know government policy in the post World War II era gave birth to the vaunted American middle class. And we know that African Americans were systematically locked out of the benefits of those policies. Just today, Seth Moulden of Massachusetts introduced legislation in order to give the GI benefits to the descendants of Black World War II veterans who were blocked out from those benefits. So all we need to think about is a dual housing market, a dual labor market, residential segregation. All we need to do is think about segregation in schools. We know that it's deliberate policy that produced racial inequality in this country. And we also know, although we don't want to admit it, because to do so would be to acknowledge what I'm saying, would be to acknowledge what I'm saying, and to do that would be to admit to the crime that there is a different form of policing for Black people here than for white people. All we have to do is think back to January 6th and compare how the police responded to that mob and how they responded to the peaceful Black Lives Matter protests. To accept responsibility for the past would be to release ourselves from its grip. Americans are trapped in a history we refuse to know but carry within ourselves. The terrors and panic we experience have everything to do with the gap between who we imagine ourselves to be and who deep down we really are. And that the nation actively evades confronting this gap locks the country into a kind of perpetual adolescence where those who desperately hold on to the American myth as some kind of New World Eden refuse to grow up. It's as if we've been condemned to a kind of corruption because we cling to the innocence of youth. Imagine being stuck forever in Never Never Land, never wanting to be responsible, never wanting to hold oneself to account. Protecting our democracy involves taking responsibility for what we have done and what we are doing, not sticking our heads in the sand or hiding behind the myth of American exceptionalism, but telling the truth about what we see. That there are those among us who believe that ours must remain a white nation, who will do anything to resist the idea that we could ever be a genuinely multiracial democracy. They believe that the nation belongs to them and the rest of us should simply be grateful. We must tell the truth so that we might release ourselves into a different way of being together. So we must take responsibility. Now, the second element involves accountability. I won't keep you too long. I'm trying to get to the end here. The second element involves accountability. We never want to hold ourselves accountable for what we've done. And oftentimes that involves the intimacy of our hatreds. I'm thinking about a piece just published yesterday by Tim Alberta about the young freshman congressman, Peter Meyer from Western Michigan, who voted to impeach Donald Trump after the insurrection of January 6th, and how he has struggled with his own kind of membership in a party that has been overrun by illiberalism. and how he's chosen in some way to be quiet in his criticism, how he watched his sister Haley radicalized, falling into the traps of QAnon and the like. The intimacies of our hatreds, that it's not just simply the loud racists, it's our family members, those folk who have in some ways bought into the idea that ours must remain a white nation. We must remember that if racial inequality is the result of deliberate policy, as I said, we have to be just as deliberate, no matter the intimacy of our hatreds. We must be just as deliberate in our efforts to dismantle racial inequality as we were in creating it. That means holding ourselves accountable for the country we've built, holding ourselves accountable for the disparities in healthcare revealed by COVID-19, holding ourselves accountable for the fact that we have witnessed over the last 40 years the erosion of the social safety net in this country, holding ourselves accountable for attempts to disenfranchise not only Black voters and brown voters, but young people across the country, low wealth people across the country, holding ourselves accountable for the declaration that the so-called welfare state was anathema, and the triangulating Democrats who agreed with the Reaganism's view. COVID was like a blue dye shot into the social body of the United States, and COVID-19 revealed where the illnesses lie. But here we are, right now, facing 1,000 dead every day, and we can't pass a pared down Build Back Better bill. We don't want to offer a living wage, just $15 an hour to people we once called essential workers. Greed and selfishness have infected the heart of the country. But if we hold ourselves accountable as a nation for each other, we have to reimagine our obligation to each other. We have to change the social circumstances, the context that allowed us to stand by and watch the state lock up millions of our fellows. We have to change the circumstance, the context which allowed us to demonize the poor and valorize the rich. Holding the nation accountable for what it has done and what it is doing. If we claim responsibility for our actions, then we must be held accountable to change. This will require that we tell the truth and then a bit more. Protecting our democracy in this moment involves taking responsibility, holding ourselves accountable, and lastly, taking the imaginative risk to be otherwise, to be bold in the fight. We have to fight for a new America. Every time in our history when we stand on the precipice of substantive change, every time when the cornerstone of white supremacy is about to be removed, we have doubled down on our ugliness. We turn our backs on a different possibility. Every single time a new America is about to be born, the umbilical cord of white supremacy has been wrapped around the baby's neck. We have to name the enemies of our democracy today. And they aren't all the followers of Donald Trump. There are forces about that are using the openness of democracy to undermine it. They look to Hungary's Viktor Orban as a model. We have to fight the selfishness and greed that allows some to stand by and watch it all happen while they pack their pockets with dollars, while they send themselves to space, while everyday ordinary people are struggling to make ends meet. We must stop fighting on old battlefields, shift the ground beneath our feet. And we can do this as we join together to face the cascading crises that threaten to shatter the very foundation of this country. We need a new moral and social contract with each other, an articulated set of obligations that we have for our fellows, one rooted in healthcare, one rooted in a guaranteed quality of life, one rooted in safety and security, one rooted that everyone should have the right to vote, no matter their zip code, no matter the color of their skin. All of this will involve fighting in the streets and at the ballot box. It will entail challenging political elites and organizations that claim that they're working for you, but who are only tinkering around the edges of an old frame. We cannot go back to what was. We cannot go back to what was. What was involved people having to choose between paying the rent and putting food on the table. What was involved police killing our loved ones. What was involved an education system, a healthcare system that failed us repeatedly. What was a country committed to the idea that some people, because of the color of their skin, ought to be valued more than others. We can't go back to that. Hell, we are living in it now as COVID rages still. We must understand that protecting our democracy and imagining America anew are moral and ethical undertakings. Both must be the result of that examination of ourselves, free of the myths of America, an examination that entails finally growing up and taking responsibility for what we have done and holding ourselves accountable for building a new world. This is the pathway for being otherwise. So much of American culture and politics today is bound up with the banal facts of racism in our daily lives and our willful refusal to acknowledge who benefits and who suffers from it all. Underneath it all is the lie that corrupts American life. It corrupts how we imagine governance. It corrupts how we think about our private lives, constraining even who we can love. It corrupts how we think about the workplace, how we imagine community and the broader good. It corrupts even, it even tells us which votes matter. I don't know how much more this punch drunk country can take. But what I do know is that if we're going to change, we have to ask ourselves, do we have the courage and the will to fight for a new America? Not to tinker, but to fight, to tell the truth and then a bit more. We have to accept the beauty and ugliness of who we are in our most vulnerable moments in communion with each other. There, a profound mutuality develops and becomes the basis for a genuine democratic community where we can all flourish if we so choose. That choice is before us now. What will we do this time? What will we do?